Hi, everyone. We're going to spend the last part of the class talking about fractals. And I think at the end of the last video, I said we were going to talk about parametric processes, but that actually will be coming a little bit later on in the term. So we're going to move to thinking about the relationships between the rules we've been speaking about so far this class and how rules are needed in order to generate fractals. Okay, so let's start off by thinking about what a fractal is and what some of the properties are. And this is a particular fractal. It's called the Koch curve. And you're just sort of seeing an animation of how the Koch curve is generated and the rules that control it. So we start with a line, then we divide the line into three sections. We extrude the central section and turn it into an equilateral triangle. And then we repeat that for every new section that we have generated. So these are iterative repeated rules in that you have a sequence, and then you repeat these rules where they then act upon themselves in order to, every rule is acting on the last set of rules that have been executed in order to generate something. One of the things that we say then about these fractals is that they are self-similar, and you can see from the video below what we mean by self-similar, in that it is a nesting structure. As we zoom into it, we keep seeing the structure repeated over and over and over again, and this moves on infinitely because we keep repeating the rules in an infinite way. And so that surface area that is the perimeter of the fractal just gets more and more and more granular. And as you zoom in, you keep seeing the same repeated pattern because it's the same rule that's generating the pattern. Having trouble moving the slide forward. Here we go. All right. So this particular curve, the Koch curve, also has what's known as its fractal dimension. And I just want to explain to you what is meant by a fractal dimension. So we have an initial segment. We call that the initiator, which is a particular length. So let's assign that as length 1. Then we break the original section down into 3 parts and extrude that central segment. So now we have 4 segments, and each of these is 1/3 of the original segment. So we look at segment number 1 over here, and this is dimension 1, which is 1/3 of the original dimension. And then we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 segments that are each that same dimension. So we think of this as being length 4/3. So 4 in the original 3 of this being 1/3 large. Then when we iterate one more time, we're now at level 2. Now we have each of these segments is broken down into 3 again. So, and because there were 4 of these, we have 16 segments, and each is 1/9 of the original segment that was this dimension, this one. So now we're looking at a dimension of 16/9. When we go into it the next time around, we now have it going down one more level. So now we have 64 segments, each of which is 1/27th of the original dimension. And so what happens is that every time you do an iteration of this, we're getting into a finer and finer fractional dimension, which works out to a ratio of 1.26186. And this is known as the fractional dimension, or the fractal dimension. And the higher the fractional dimension, the rougher the surface is. So the more sort of cragginess we have. And this is one way of being able to distinguish between different fractals, how smooth they are, how bumpy they are. All of them have kind of an infinite surface area because you can keep on subdividing it indefinitely, but some infinites are larger than other infinites, and this pertains to the fractal dimension. Okay, we also talk about fractals as being scale-free, and this is because of this idea that as you're zooming in, we keep on seeing the same repeated structure over and over again. But there's other interesting things about scale-free dimensions, because it becomes hard to say, well, how do you measure how long it is? And the answer is, how long is your ruler? So in the first instance, we have a segment, and we could say, all right, well, this is a particular dimension. right? But then if we were to zoom in on the fractal, then we'd be able to say, oh, actually, no, there's 4 of these slightly shorter rulers. And if we zoom in more, then we wind up having 16 of these even shorter rulers. So the more detailed we get, the more granular we get as we're zooming in, the longer the perimeter dimension is becoming. It's sort of like, you know, if you imagine that you're measuring something and you've kind of got a very rough measurement, then you go in for more accuracy, and now you're moving that ruler around more and more and more, but you need a tinier ruler to move around more. So we can see that if we were to look at a part of the fractal with just blurry vision, we might estimate the dimension as being this ruler length, but then as we come in at a more fine-grained detail, it gets longer, and at an even finer grained detail, it gets longer and longer and longer. Again, this idea that it's an infinite dimension, depending on how closely you are zooming into it. So this kind of goes to this idea of how long is the coastline of England? And if we imagine that the coastline of England is actually a fractal surface, that you can measure it with finer and finer measuring sticks. If we go with a very coarse measuring stick and we say, well, we're going to measure it in mile-long segments, and so we zoom in on Google Earth and you start placing a ruler that's a mile long and going around all the little inlets, then imagine how much the length of it would change if you instead were going in with a ruler that was only half an inch long, right? And now you have to go and trace every single little cove and crack and rocky outcrop. Obviously, the dimension that you're going to get is going to be longer and longer. So the idea is, how long is the coast of England? It depends on the length of your measuring stick. And we see sort of zooming in with these different measuring sticks and the difference that that would make. Okay, let's move to a different fractal. So there's all kinds of ways of generating fractals. The Koch curve is the first one that we looked at. Here's another one. This is known as the Sierpinski carpet. You can look at it and think, well, what rules generated this carpet? So we had the first set of rules that generated the Koch curve. And now with the Sierpinski carpet, we start with the triangle. We put a smaller triangle on the inside that subdivides it into 4 equal triangles. And then with each of these new triangles, we take the outer triangle and we maintain a hollow in the center. And then we take the outer triangles that have been created and in turn insert a new triangle. And we keep repeating that process over and over and over again until we sort of have this sort of fractal surface of hollows that goes deeper and deeper and deeper in, and the hollows get smaller and smaller and smaller, always triangular. But again, we could zoom in on this, and as we zoom in, we would see the same structure repeating over and over and over again. So we can look at this in 2 dimensions, but we can also look at this in 3 dimensions, and then you get into volumetric fractals. So here's the same fractal, the Sierpinski triangle, but now it becomes the Sierpinski pyramid. And you can see that it is again the same structure that is inherently internally repeating itself and going into an infinite tiny sort of sponge of fractal openings as we get that finer and finer detail. If you have an opportunity and are on a road trip at some point, you can go to Breckenridge, Minnesota. It's not that far from Iowa. And a math class there actually built a Sierpinski triangle. So a little bit of travel trivia for you. Okay, one of the most famous fractals is the Mandelbrot set. Again, fractals are just built from having a very simple initiating rule that then iterates upon itself. But the Mandelbrot set is a particularly compelling fractal. That increasingly, unlike the Sierpinski triangle or the Koch curve, in this case, as we iterate, some of the nature of the iterations mean that we don't have an absolutely repeating pattern. Instead, we have much more dynamic patterns that become enfolded within the set. It's still just one rule that's generating it, but the output of that rule is not so clearly self-repeating. Instead, it has more complexity as the rule sort of moves back and forth and cascades on itself, and different things feed back upon it in ways that become more interesting. So let's watch a little video that just talks about the particular beauty of the Mandelbrot set. And the Mandelbrot set is something that we will also come back to a little bit later on. Okay, here we go. Let's take a look at the Mandelbrot set. So one thing you can think about here is how when we were zooming in on the Sierpinski triangle, how we kept seeing the same pattern repeating and repeating. In this case, as we're zooming in deeper and deeper into the fractal, we're seeing that there's an incredible array of different patterning that's occurring. And yet there are some commonalities. We still see some repeats. We see some recurrent patterns that appear, and yet all this incredible productive variety in between. And we can think back as well to Conway's Game of Life and how we had all of that productivity, generative productivity within the cellular automata. And here we're seeing it within the fractal. It's also worth bearing in mind that while the video will eventually stop, the fractal keeps going. With every new iteration creating a new sort of depth within that fractal. Okay, I think we're almost towards the end of the video, but I'm going to pause it regardless, just so that we can move on from here. Well, wait a minute. I think we're almost done. 11 more seconds. Here we go. And we get the structure that we started with at that very end, which is amazing. Okay, so I think fractals are probably the best demonstration of how very, very simple rules can get you to very, very complex forms. the fractal is derived from a very simple equation, but over time you get more and more complex iterative feedback from within the fractal as elements are interacting with themselves and constraining what happens within that equation. And so we get this incredible richness. There's a relationship between fractals, chaos, and complexity. Fractals are considered to be chaotic versus complex systems, and the study of chaos deals with what we call deterministic systems. And when we say deterministic, what we mean is that if I start the Mandelbrot fractal, it's going to, that equation plays itself out identically every single time. The same way that if you were to draw the Koch curve, you have your initial segment, you have a simple rule, and every time you draw that Koch curve, it will look identical. It is incredibly complex, but it is identical. It's determined by the initial conditions. At the same time, it can be sensitive to initial conditions, because if I make a slight variation to that initial starting place or rule, I can get something different. Trajectories of these can therefore diverge exponentially over time, which we call the butterfly effect. These are thought of as being closed rather than open systems, because the rules are just interacting with themselves. Complex systems are different because the rules are tending to interact with an outside environment, and that outside environment is also providing feedback to the system. So when we have a flock of starlings that are flying around, we can't just look at the starlings in and of themselves. We have to look at the starlings within an environment, and that environment is providing some input which they're also interacting with, and that is part of what is generating the complexity of the system. So that is one of the key differences between fractals and complexity. They are linked, but complex systems have this openness to the environment. So there's always some kind of external input that is helping change some of the interactions. We get, in chaos, very complex patterns from these very simple rules. And what's interesting is that in complexity, it's sometimes almost the opposite. In complexity, we talk about how you can get very coherent patterns that come about because of complex interactions. So when we saw the segregation model, we had a very coherent pattern that emerged, very sort of separated, you know, white cells versus black cells, right? And that was a clear, coherent pattern. And that started from what appeared to be very, very random. So those rules were taking something that started random and seemed to make it more organized and make it more structured. Whereas in chaotic systems, you might start from something very, very simple, like a line, and then over time, that line becomes more and more sort of variegated or complex. Okay, so some key takeaways, and these are just two sort of images. These are both from that Mandelbrot set. So we have the same fractal, but different aspects can be expressed within that fractal depending on where you are within kind of that rule series. And it's interesting to think about this in terms of evolution and biology, and how our cells, you know, are starting from the same starting point, but somehow differentiate to form, you know, a kidney versus a heart versus a liver. So how do you get all of this complexity within the human body, starting from the same initial cell that is dividing, but then maybe different aspects of that cell are differentiating in different ways based on these kind of relational conditions that the cells find themselves within. So forms of fractals are based on simple rules that iteratively act on themselves. Forms unfold in time through relational sequences rather than being static. Fractals are generated, they're not designed, so we get all of this beautiful, you know, beautiful array of patterns that are coming, not because someone is thinking about it from the top down, but it's just being productive within. And fractals are self-similar in that they have these sort of scale-free qualities that as you're looking through them, you see repeated patterns, either the very straightforward repeated patterns that we saw that were quite literal within the Sierpinski triangle that was an identical reproduction, but also within the Mandelbrot set where we sort of see recurrent patterns that basically cascade, change, but you see themes that start to reappear over and over again as we go deeper and deeper in scale. Okay, thank you so much.